January 31st, 1896. Pearl Bryan has left her home in Greencastle, Indiana, and is traveling by train to Cincinnati, Ohio. When she arrives, she's to meet the man she'd been seeing, Scott Jackson, a student at the Ohio College of Dental Surgery. You see, Pearl is pregnant with Scott's child, and even though she wants to marry, he has other plans. What happens that night will shock the world, send two men to the gallows, and leave behind questions that 128 years later still remain a mystery. This is the story of Pearl Bryan, a headless homicide. Hey y'all, I'm Chris Calvert.
And I'm her husband, Rob Potter. Welcome to Hitch to Homicide.
For better or worse.
Till death do us part.
Welcome back, everybody.
Yes, welcome. And for our Baoli-speaking friends on the Ivory Coast of Southwest Africa.
Okay.
That's a mouthful. Akwaba.
Welcome.
Yes, welcome.
Well, wherever you're listening, be sure to hit that subscribe button. Then you can like, rate, and review the podcast so others who like true crime just like you can find us. And if you're watching us on YouTube, hit that subscribe button below.
Yep.
You can find us on Instagram at Hitch to Homicide or on X at H2H_podcast. And if you want true crime every single day, 24/7, all the time.
All crime every day, all day.
Please join our closed Facebook group, The In-Laws and Outlaws. Go to Facebook, type in H2H In-Laws and Outlaws, answer a couple questions. You're in. Go join. If you're a regular, you probably just said that whole thing with me. In unison.
I was doing it with my lips.
I like to post photos and other stuff in the In-Laws and Outlaws. It's a great group of people. We really like them a lot.
Yep.
We also now have a Buy Me a Coffee link if you want to send Rob some coffee. He drinks it even when he's not on camera or recording the podcast.
It's the nectar of the gods.
You can find that link in our show notes. We appreciate all the messages, all the emails. Thank you, everybody, for always reaching out to us and for being here with us each and every week.
Yes.
This is an older case, way older, 128 years old.
Yeah, I was going to say, man.
But it was interesting to read the old newspaper articles and hear about streets and areas that I know from Cincinnati, even though it was 128 years ago. Rob and I have both actually lived in Cincinnati.
Yeah, I lived there for 11 years.
During our younger years, back when we didn't know each other.
Before there was a river there. I'm just kidding.
Back when the dinosaurs roamed.
Exactly.
Cincinnati's a lovely city. I just have to say, Rob is still a Bengals and a Reds fan. He has stuck with them through thick and thin.
Die hard.
He is a diehard, but now he's got Joey Burrow, so he's very happy.
Yes, we have a chance this year.
But he also does complain about the Reds from time to time.
All the talent in the world, but they are in third place right now.
Well, if you're a Reds fan, you know what we're talking about.
Yep.
Before I get started on this 128-year-old case, let me thank some sources. The New York Times, the Indianapolis Star, the Dayton Daily News, Wikipedia, Gutenberg.org, the Cincinnati Library, Quimby.com, the Skeleton Key Chronicles, usgenwebsites.org, and the Kentucky Post Times.
All right.
I also want to thank our in-law and outlaw member, Mary Ritchie, for suggesting this case.
Nice. Thanks, Mary.
Thank you very much, Mary.
Well, you ready?
I am.
Let's do it.
Pearl Bryan was born on October 25th, 1872 in Greencastle, Indiana.
Okay.
I know where that is. I've lived in Indiana before.
Okay.
Her parents were Alexander and Susan Jane Farrow Bryan. She's the third youngest in a family of 12 children.
Wow, there must not have been a lot to do in Greencastle, Indiana.
Cheaper by the dozen. That's all I could think of.
Yeah.
Her family, according to newspapers at the time, belonged to Greencastle, Indiana's best social set. Pearl's dad raised stock, farm animals, cows and pigs for slaughter, and he was also a dairy farmer.
Oh, okay.
And Pearl lived with her parents on the outside of Greencastle in Putnam County.
Okay.
Now, when Pearl is 22, her cousin Will Wood, and yes, that's really his name.
Will Wood.
Will Wood. Will Wood's daddy is a reverend, is a right reverend.
Gotcha.
Pearl's uncle is a minister.
Okay.
But he brings a friend over to Pearl's house, and she meets Scott Jackson. He was a student at the Indiana Dental College in Indianapolis, where he was working for a dentist. But his mother, Sarah Jackson, lived in Greencastle.
All right.
And in the spring of 1895, Pearl's cousin Will introduces Pearl to Scott at Pearl's family's home. It was love at first sight when Pearl met Scott.
I know that feeling.
Pearl had rejected many suitors before. Is this where I get to say, I know that feeling?
Yes.
But she immediately fell for Jack's charms.
Oh.
She was perfectly infatuated with him.
She was smitten.
From the start. She's infatuated with Scott from the start.
Okay.
He's 27 years old. He has blonde hair, blue eyes. Later, they're going to be described as cold eyes. He was born in Maine and had crossed the ocean 14 times when he was just a little boy.
Wow.
His father was a sea captain.
Gotcha.
He lived with his brother in New York and in Jersey City after his dad passed away. And at one time, he was indicted in New Jersey for robbing a railway company.
Good Lord.
Yeah, he worked there in the office.
Wow.
So I don't know what he was stealing.
Yeah.
He got out of jail time by turning state's evidence that sent another employee to prison.
Okay.
So he's a snitch, right?
He's a rat.
He's a snitch.
Yep.
Snitches get stitches.
They do get stitches.
Not long after this, he went to Indiana where he lived with a brother-in-law who was a professor at DePaul University, and then his mother in Greencastle, and this is where he meets Pearl.
Gotcha.
These two form a romantic relationship, and according to Will, her cousin, Pearl was, quote, completely under his power, end quote. Now, these two keep their relationship hidden from Pearl's family. I don't know why, and the entire community of Greencastle. But Scott is happy to be sleeping with Pearl on the sly. By the end of the summer of 1895, Scott ends the relationship abruptly. It's over. And he was moving to Cincinnati and transferring to the dental school there.
Okay.
After he leaves, Pearl discovers she's pregnant.
Uh-oh.
She confides in her cousin Will that she's pregnant with Scott's baby, and Will, who, remember, is friends with Scott, writes to Scott and says, hey,
Yo, dude.
Pearl's pregnant.
Yeah. Got a bun in the oven.
That's exactly what he said back in 1896, honey. 1895, sorry.
Yeah, that's where it originated.
What am I going to do with you?
I don't know.
When Scott hears this, he sends letters to Pearl not saying, I'm so sorry, I'm here for you. His letters contained recipes for drugs to induce a miscarriage.
Whoa.
Yeah. Ergo and rye. And Pearl refused to get the ingredients or to take them.
Right.
When Scott came back in December for Christmas, Pearl is still pregnant, and he confides in Will Wood that he, quote, needed to get rid of her, end quote. Not the baby, but Pearl, I believe.
Yeah, we'll take care of everything.
Scott does meet with Pearl, and he admitted that, yes, he knew that the baby was his. But then he tells Will of two plans that he has. Number one was to take her to a room, like a boarding house, kill her there and leave her. I think that was with poison, so it looked like she had committed suicide.
Right.
The other was to cut her to pieces and dispose of the parts in different vaults around town, meaning catacombs or tombs.
Jeez.
I also read in another story that he was just going to chop her up and put her down different storm drains. He had done research and had asked about the quickest poisons to kill a person, but cocaine was the only one that could be purchased legally.
Oh, wow. Well, yeah, back in those days, I mean, even Coca-Cola used to have cocaine in it. Yeah.
It just makes me think of the song, It's All Right, It's All Right, Cocaine.
Cocaine. Or as they say in Mexico, cocaine.
Cocaine. He also tells Will Woods that maybe he could perform an abortion on Pearl, and that if he had just had the right instruments, he could do it himself. Yeah, because you've had like a year of dental school, Scott.
Yeah.
And before he left after Christmas holiday, he asked Will if he would help to persuade Pearl to come to Cincinnati for the procedure. Then Scott wrote to Will telling him that he'd found a room for Pearl in Cincinnati and that he had made all the arrangements for an abortion and that he had taken care of everything.
Okay.
On January 28th, 1896, Pearl is nearly 5 months pregnant now.
No. Wow.
Pearl leaves her parents' home in Greencastle, telling them that she's going to Indianapolis to visit a friend who lived on Central Avenue.
Now, do her parents know about this by now?
Her parents do not know she's pregnant. No one knows she's pregnant except for her cousin Will and her ex-lover Scott.
Okay, so at 5 months, she's really not showing yet.
Well, I'm sure she's showing, but it is her first baby, and she's wearing a corset.
Okay.
So she's hiding it.
Okay.
And it's 1896, so big skirts.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think anybody knew I was pregnant the first time until I was about 6 months pregnant.
Okay.
Before she leaves on this trip, she borrows a small suitcase from her sister to take with her. That's called foreshadowing.
Oh, here we go. Ready, Scotty? Here we go.
Yes. But she didn't go to Indianapolis. She went to Cincinnati to see Scott Jackson. When she gets off the train, her plan is to convince Scott that he needed to marry her. He needed to do the honorable thing and make her his wife.
Man up.
Yeah. Or was that really the plan? Because according to other sources, and not the local newspapers at the time, which wouldn't even say she was pregnant, but skirted around the subject and called an abortion an illegal operation. Pearl knew that she was coming to Cincinnati and that Scott and his roommate Alonzo Walling were planning together to give Pearl an abortion.
Okay.
So not only is she going to allow Scott to give her an abortion, but also his random roommate,
Jeez.
Alonzo.
Wow.
When she arrives, Scott was supposed to meet her at the train. Do you think he met her at the train?
I'm going to say no.
No, he didn't meet her at the train.
Yeah.
Pearl goes straight to the Ohio College of Dental Surgery on Court Street and Central Avenue, but she can't find him there. So she takes a carriage. This is a horse-drawn carriage. She takes a carriage to the Indiana house in downtown Cincinnati and gets herself a room.
Okay.
But she doesn't register at the hotel in her own name. She uses the name of her sister, Mrs. Maud Stanley of Greencastle, Indiana.
All right.
Now, she somehow gets a message to Scott. The newspaper said by messenger. So I don't know if that's like writing a note, taking it down to the front desk, and a kid there picks up the note and runs it over to the school.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah.
But when Pearl sees Scott for the first time, he introduces her to his roommate, Alonzo Walling. Alonzo had dark hair and hazel eyes. He had spent most of his life in Hamilton, Ohio, which is just a stone's throw from Cincinnati.
Yep.
It's now January 30th, 1896. Scott, Pearl, and Alonzo are all walking down the street in front of a music publishing company in downtown Cincinnati. And the employees of this business see Pearl with Scott and Alonzo. They're actually sitting on a shipping dock. The employees are sitting on a shipping dock and eating their lunch.
Okay.
And they overhear Pearl say, quote, "I'm going back to my home, and Scott Jackson, you will have to answer to my brother Fred for this," end quote.
That can't be good.
And more than one person hears Pearl threaten Scott. So to me, that means she's saying, I want to get married, and he's saying no. And she's saying, fine, I'm going home. You're going to have to answer to Fred. On Friday, January 31st, 1896, Scott, Alonzo, and Pearl are in Dave Wallingford's saloon on the corner of George and Plum Streets in downtown Cincinnati. They're in the sitting room.
Okay.
Scott and Alonzo are drinking whiskey, and Pearl is having a sarsaparilla. And I looked up what sarsaparilla actually was.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just it was really popular in the United States in the 19th century. And according to the advertisements of the time, it was considered to be a remedy for skin and blood problems.
Really?
Yeah. Add a little snake oil to that, honey.
Yeah. So sarsaparilla, was it kind of like a ginger ale or something?
I think it's a little bit more like a root beer.
Oh, okay.
In the United States, I think it was a little bit more like a root beer.
Yeah.
But the Oxford Companion to American Food and Drink notes that it evokes images of, quote, languid bells and parched cowboys, end quote. I loved that. Nothing worse than a parched cowboy.
Yeah.
A waiter at the saloon, his name is Alan Johnson, sees Scott put something into Pearl's drink without her knowing it. So, ladies, it's been happening for centuries, apparently. Men spiking our drinks at a bar.
Yep.
Sorry, just had to get it in there. Now, remember I said the only legal drug that Scott could purchase was cocaine.
Mm-hmm.
And prior to that Friday, a druggist on 6th Street in Cincinnati sold Scott and Alonzo cocaine.
Wow.
These three get in a carriage that is driven by George Jackson, who takes all three of them across the river into Fort Thomas, Kentucky. And George thinks, this is the driver, George thinks that the girl is really groggy or drunk or drugged. And he drops them off in Fort Thomas, somewhere around Highland Avenue and Alexandria Pike. And for people who don't know, if you're in Cincinnati, you cross the river, you're in Kentucky.
Yep.
And a stone's throw, you are in Fort Thomas.
Yep. There's Covington, Fort Thomas, all those little cities.
Newport.
Yep. Newport.
Right.
Yep.
And here's a little Jeopardy answer for you.
All right.
What is the one defining thing about the Cincinnati International Airport?
Oh, that's the Cincinnati, but it's in Kentucky.
It sits in the state of Kentucky.
Yeah.
The Cincinnati International Airport is actually in Kentucky.
CVG.
Yeah.
Yep.
So this driver thinks she's drunk or drugged. He drops them off in Fort Thomas around Highland Avenue and Alexandria Pike. And what happens next, we can only deduce from the evidence left behind.
Okay.
But while out in the middle of northern Kentucky farmland, Scott Jackson and Alonzo Walling murder Pearl Bryan and cut off her head.
Oh, wow.
They cut off her head because they don't want anybody to know who the body belongs to.
Wow.
And they cut off her head while she is still alive.
Oh, my gosh. Wow.
When they're done, this is what is thought to have happened. They take her head and place it in the same suitcase Pearl brought with her to Cincinnati, the one she'd borrowed from her sister. And they go back to Cincinnati. And they leave her body near a row of hedges. And it's not concealed at all. I've seen this photograph. It's just out in the middle of this farmland next to a row, like a fence row of hedges, of a hedge.
Right.
Later that night, when it is almost midnight, Scott and Alonzo go back to the bar. They go back to the saloon on 9th and Plum Street, which is just across the street from where these two live together. They come back to the bar. Pearl's not with them, but one of them is carrying what the bartender would call a, quote, brown grip. It's the suitcase.
Oh, so they're carrying her head around.
These two give it to the bartender to place behind the bar for them. Keep this for us.
Oh, jeez.
Keep this for us, please.
Wow.
And when the bartender takes the small suitcase, he says it's something, quote, rolled back and forth like a bowling ball, end quote. Alonzo and Scott both leave the saloon that night. The suitcase is still behind the bar. Then on February 1st, 1896, 17-year-old Johnny Hewling is perched in an apple tree pruning out dead branches when he sees a woman's body below. I also read that he was walking to work when he sees a body. I think the newspaper article said he was whistling and walking to work. Okay. They like to fictionalize these stories a little bit in the newspaper, too.
They were very descriptive back then. Yeah.
She's on the side of the road next to this hedge fence. Her arms were extended. Palms of her hands were down with her fingers tightly clenched. And just above her feet was a small pool of blood. But on the leaves of the bushes are all these drops of blood. And on top of the dead leaves that were thick around her body were blood stains. But most disturbing of all was the fact that this body of a woman didn't have a head.
Right.
Now, word traveled really fast. You wouldn't think that it would.
Yeah.
But word traveled fast, and women and men and children, apparently, all flocked to the scene. And all these people basically compromised the crime scene.
Right.
Now, the first officials there were Sheriff Jewel Plummer of Campbell County, Kentucky.
Jewel.
Some great names in here. Just wait. And then the coroner of Campbell County also showed up.
Okay.
But also was the head of the investigations department for the Cincinnati Police Department. His name is Cal Krim.
Cal Krim.
Yeah, what a great name.
It is.
And with him is his partner, Jack McDermott, who is also a detective. And you might be wondering why two Cincinnati detectives are crossing the river into Kentucky. Why are they going to be assigned to this case?
Mm-hmm.
Well, Krim, who will go on to start his own private detective agency, of course he does with that name.
Yeah.
He has said that they were assigned as members of the Cincinnati police who had the task of investigating and keeping under control the, quote, houses of ill repute, end quote. So they're in charge of keeping track of the brothels. And because it wasn't all that common for one of these sex workers from a brothel to go missing, these two show up because they're thinking,
sure, we're
going to be able to identify this body pretty quickly as one of the girls that has just disappeared, somebody who was on their list of missing persons.
Of course.
They will stay on as detectives in the case, helping the one officer, the sheriff, Jewel Plummer. So he's got this headless body and he needs some help. So these two detectives from Cincinnati are going to stick with him.
So he's sort of like the Andy Griffith of Fort Thomas.
Yes, he is. Yeah, the one guy in Fort Thomas. When they investigate the scene, they found that blood was all over the bushes, several feet away from where Pearl's body is located. Okay. And they're thinking that showed that the murder actually happened right there on that site.
Right.
And the coroner noted that only a still beating heart could have sent blood that distance. As her head was being severed.
Well, and that would kind of explain why she had clenched fists also.
Yeah. So, I mean, you hit that jugular vein or,
whether
carotid artery and...
whether she's drugged or not, I mean, the body's still going to react to something traumatic like that.
Well, she was able to walk because they had their arms around her and they were walking her out of the carriage. So,
sad.
Blood was also reported to be 6 to 9 inches deep in some places at the scene.
Wow.
So she just bled out right there.
Oh, yeah.
And this just confirms that, they killed her on the spot.
Yeah.
Pearl's headless body was found lying on the bank with the feet higher than the body. So it was kind of on a little embankment with the row of hedges at the top.
Right.
And her feet are higher and her body is down lower. And the clothing was all disarranged. That suggested that there was a struggle. A big struggle had taken place before she was killed.
Wow.
She had a deep to-the-bone cut on her left hand, indicating that she had tried to ward off the attack. So she had some defensive wounds. And she was also struck by a rock wrapped in a handkerchief, which will later be determined to belong to Scott Jackson.
Wow.
They also find a suit of knitted union underwear, a thin kimono, a pair of shoes, and rubber overshoes. She was wearing a, quote, Mother Hubbard type of dress in blue calico. She had black stockings, a new white corset, and a pair of yellow-brown kid gloves.
Okay.
All of these articles are found lying scattered around or near the body. But the only thing that has any sort of identification are the shoes. They were made by Drew Selby and Company, the shoe manufacturers in Portsmouth, Ohio.
Okay.
The shoes had a French numbering system, and the 22-11 meant that the shoes were a size 3 with a B width, and there was also a stock number, 62458.
All right.
But before they even thought about identifying the body, they called in the bloodhounds in an effort to trace the killers and possibly find the missing head. And the dogs made their way to a cistern near where the body was found, but the trail ended there. Then the dogs picked up a scent that led them to the nearby Covington Waterworks. But the dogs wouldn't leave the waterworks, and the officials decided, well, then we just need to drain this reservoir to look for Pearl's missing head. They don't know it's Pearl.
Sure.
35 million gallons of water were taken out at a cost of $2,000, which is roughly $75,000 today.
Wow.
And again, the crowds gathered, and they wanted to see if a head was going to be at the bottom of this drained reservoir.
Right.
But there was nothing. The Miami and Erie canals that ran through Cincinnati were also drained at several points in the investigation, but no one ever found a head.
Of course.
That night, Saturday, February 1st, after Pearl's body has been found, Scott and Alonzo go back to this saloon and they pick up the suitcase. And the bartender says something was rolling around in the bag. And Scott and Alonzo leave the bar with the bag. They come back 15 minutes later and they give it back to the bartender to put behind the bar. Only this time, the bartender said it was so light that he thought it was empty. Now, for several days, the body will be on exhibition at the Newport morgue and viewed by thousands of people.
What?
Yeah, but no one seemed to know who she was.
Okay.
Now, meanwhile, they've contacted this shoe manufacturer, and what they learn is that shoes in that stock number went to a shoe store called Lewis & Hayes in Greencastle, Indiana. The detectives go to Greencastle and interview Lewis & Hayes, who traced these shoes being purchased by Pearl Bryan on November 18th, 1895 for $3.50.
Okay.
Or $130 today.
Oh, wow.
She had some nice shoes.
Yeah. Yeah.
Her family was wealthy. Apparently their house was beautiful. You know, they were part of the social scene, right?
Right. $3 was equivalent to
$130.
Wow.
Yeah. The shoes were cloth top with patent leather button fasteners. Now, when they learn of the name Pearl Bryan, detectives Krim, Plummer, and McDermott go to the nearby millinery store because the guys at the shoe store say the woman who works at the hat shop is Pearl's sister.
And what is a millinery?
It's a hat shop.
Oh, okay.
The millinery store.
Okay.
It's the women's hat shop.
I did not know that.
Yeah.
Okay.
A haberdashery, I believe, is a men's store with hats.
Okay.
Millinery store is just women's hats. And we have those here in Kentucky because everybody wears a hat to
The
Kentucky Derby.
Yeah,
that's right.
Yeah.
But this millinery store is operated by Pearl's sister. And there, these three detectives tell her and Pearl's brother, Fred, what they found. And they get together with Pearl's parents, who were starting to believe that even though Pearl had told them that she was going to Indianapolis to visit a friend, they're starting to worry that maybe that headless body that was found in Cincinnati was, in fact, their daughter Pearl.
Right.
They leave for Cincinnati. They're going to go identify the body. Now, while in Greencastle, Detective Krim starts asking around, and he discovers from a local telegraph operator that there was a man named Scott Jackson whose mother lived in Greencastle. He'd been sending telegraphs to Pearl's cousin, Will Wood, who just happened to be the son of the Reverend D.M. Wood, and it was all about Pearl's condition. So I guess, you know, telegraph, telephone, tell a friend.
Tell a Will.
Yeah. Well, not even Will. The telegraph operator is reading the messages.
Sure.
And knows that Pearl's pregnant.
Right.
Yeah. And when Detective Krim hears this, he immediately sent a telegram of his own to his department in Cincinnati saying, quote, "Arrest Scott Jackson and charge him with murder, clothes fully identified," end quote.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
He's like, oh, she was pregnant. Scott Jackson.
Yeah.
Hang on a second. I need you to send a telegraph for me. Scott Jackson was arrested on February 5th at 10 p.m. just as he was about to walk into the boarding house where he lived at 222 West 9th Street in Cincinnati. The next day, February 6th at 2 a.m., so basically the same night, they arrest Alonzo Walling primarily because he's Scott's roommate.
Right.
When they start looking closely at Scott, there are several spots of blood found on his shirt, and he had a 3-inch scratch on his wrist. He tells police that the blood spots were from killing bed bugs. Ooh.
Jeez. I didn't know bed bugs had that much blood.
Ooh. And the scratch was from a skin disease he had where he scratched spots in his sleep.
Whatever, Scott.
Yeah. But police know that he was dating Pearl Bryan. They'd been seen together over Christmas and prior to that during the summer before Christmas.
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't take long for Alonzo Walling, Scott's roommate, to start talking. He tells police that Scott left their room early on the night of January 31st and didn't return until midnight. And when Scott hears that Alonzo is talking to the police about him, he tells the police, well, it wasn't me. It was Alonzo that went out that night.
Oh, man.
So these two both tell the police that they knew about the crime, that Pearl was dead, but both of them have said that they didn't have anything to do with the actual murder of Pearl. So it was a lot of this going on. He did it.
Yep.
They had Scott dead to rights, though. They knew he had dated her from eyewitness testimony from the people in Greencastle, as well as the telegraphs. Mm-hmm. And Scott admitted that he did know Pearl, but he explained his whereabouts during the time that the police believed the murder took place. Now, meanwhile, police are taking apart the room that Scott and Alonzo share in this boarding house, and what they find is a pair of mud-covered trousers in Scott Jackson's locker at the dental college. So they take apart they go everywhere these guys go.
Jeez.
He tells police that Alonzo Walling had a key to his locker, and he had placed those pants there. Okay, Scott, okay.
He's trying.
Yeah, he's trying hard.
Wow.
They find the little suitcase, the grip, the brown grip, and inside were traces of human hair, blood, clay, and minerals and mud, which scientists, I love this was in the newspaper, which the scientists say came from the same spot where Pearl's body was found.
Gotcha.
Now, I don't know how scientific it was, but they might have been like, well, this clay matches this clay, so it must have been from here.
They had a big magnifying glass.
Yeah, I guess. Now, not only were Scott and Alonzo arrested, they arrested Pearl's cousin, William Wood, the preacher's son,
wow,
who Scott said betrayed Pearl by letting her condition be known. And he actually bonds out and will be released completely later. But they place Scott and Alonzo in jail together in Cincinnati. And then they take them to the funeral home where Pearl's body was. It was right across the street. They're like, you know what? We're going to take these two scoundrels and make them look at what they did.
Right.
And when they get them to the funeral home, Pearl's sister was there on her knees, crying and pleading with them to tell them what they had done with her head. What did you do with Pearl's head?
Jeez.
But Scott and Alonzo don't say a word. These two were indicted by the Campbell County Grand Jury on February 13th, 1896 for murder.
Okay.
They won't be moved to Campbell County until March 17th of that year. They both pled not guilty on March 23rd.
Okay.
Now, the police need to figure out how these two got Pearl across the river on the night of the murder. And they could never make a connection between Cincinnati and Fort Thomas. How did they get there?
Right.
Because nobody was coming forward. Because George Jackson was the guy who drove the carriage that night, and he was afraid to come forward to say that it was, in fact, him who drove them across the river. And he didn't come forward because he was afraid. All these death threats had been thrown around. People were making threats on the lives of Scott and Alonzo.
Gotcha.
George is a black man, and he didn't want to be associated with the two guys who beheaded the girl that everybody's ready to lynch.
Right.
But when he does come forward, he positively IDs them both as the two men who were with Pearl on January 31st, and that she acted like she was drugged, and that he dropped them off in Fort Thomas, really close to where her body was found.
That's pretty definitive.
It is.
Yeah.
Now, these two, Scott Jackson and Alonzo Walling, are awaiting trial. They're going to be tried separately. Scott and Alonzo keep trying to convince the police that each individually are innocent. Scott initially claimed he had no involvement in Pearl's disappearance or her death, despite all this evidence that linked him to the crime scene.
Okay.
When he's confronted with evidence that he's had this intimate relationship with Pearl, Scott admits, yeah, I slept with her. But he said he ended things with her after Christmas of 1895, thinking that it's somebody else's baby.
Yeah.
But he doesn't realize that they've got her body and they can tell that she was 5 months pregnant when she died.
Right.
Yeah. Scott, she got pregnant earlier in the summer.
Right.
Scott told police that he had epilepsy. And when he had a seizure, he could not account for his actions. He told them this story about how when he was a small boy living in Indianapolis, he would have these, quote, fits, seizures.
Right.
And that there would be hours that he couldn't account for. Not to be outdone, Alonzo Walling claimed that he had not seen Pearl again after Scott called him out of a restaurant on the night of the murder. He alleged Scott went off with Pearl in a cab, leaving him behind. Alonzo also said that he was a victim of hypnosis.
Wow, these guys, they're getting hit from all sides.
Yeah, they're coming up with some good stuff.
Yeah.
They should be writing a book.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, he said that Scott Jackson hypnotized him and that he had a strange influence over him, that Scott had a really strange influence over him.
Jeez.
Okay. Okay, Alonzo.
That's the best you could come up with?
Yeah. Scott Jackson's trial was first. It started on April 22nd, 1896 in Campbell County Circuit Court before Judge Charles T. Helm. And on May 14th, after the jury deliberated for 2 hours and 11 minutes, the 12 men, because there were only men on the jury at this point,
right?
The 12 men returned a verdict of guilty.
Guilty.
Murder in the first degree.
Right.
Scott Jackson was sentenced to hang on June 30th. But a motion for a new trial and appeals to a higher court kept the sentence from being carried out. For now.
Okay.
Alonzo Walling's trial started on May 26th, and during his trial, Scott was moved to the Covington, Kentucky jail for safekeeping. They had to kind of move him out of the way.
Yeah.
Because people really wanted to kill these guys.
Yeah.
On June 18th, the jurors returned their verdict after being out just 2 hours and 20 minutes for Alonzo's trial. Guilty, murder in the first degree. He, too, was sentenced to hanging, and he, too, filed an appeal.
Okay.
Now, relatives of Pearl's family were at both trials, and family members of both Alonzo Walling and Scott Jackson were at both trials. And before the verdicts were reached, I read in the newspaper where all these vigilante groups that had formed, they had decided that if the jury didn't find these two guilty, they were taking matters into their own hands.
There was going to be pitchforks and torches.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the judge let everybody in the courtroom know, look, everybody, this place is packed, but standing among you are law enforcement officials in plain clothes. And we're not going to tolerate anything but order in the courtroom.
No tomfoolery
at
here.
At the announcement of these verdicts. So they were basically saying, if you're planning on pulling a knife out or something and going after him right here, we're chock-a-block full with people.
Right.
But there are tons of police in here that you just don't know about.
Sure.
Now, while these two are awaiting their appeals, there's actually a jailbreak in the Newport, Kentucky jail where they are sitting. But Scott and Alonzo didn't leave their cells.
I don't blame them.
They were safer inside the jail than outside where people would absolutely surely kill them.
Yep.
So these two are both moved to the jail at Alexandria, Kentucky, miles away where they could remain until it was time for their hanging. And in a desperate final attempt to avoid execution, just 48 hours before their scheduled hangings, Scott Jackson and Alonzo Walling issued a joint, quote, confession, end quote, incredibly claiming that Pearl was killed by a Dr. George Wagner after Scott took her to Wagner's house for an abortion. They had zero evidence to support their story.
Wow.
Yeah, it's almost like, well, we got 48 hours before we head to the gallows. Let's come up with another story.
Let's throw this spaghetti up against the wall and see if it sticks.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The sources mention that Scott accused the police of outright perjury and suppressing evidence that would have exonerated him, but he couldn't provide any specifics to back up his claim.
Right.
Alonzo Walling also allegedly gave a, quote, full confession, end quote, to a prison chaplain, asking him to take it to Pearl's family in hopes they would petition for clemency. But the contents of this supposed confession have never been revealed.
Really?
Then on Saturday, March 20th, 1897, Scott Jackson and Alonzo Walling were to be hanged. They made their final pleas to Kentucky Governor W.O. Bradley, but he said, refusing clemency.
Not going to happen.
Out in the streets, there were thousands of people. At 11:20 a.m., March 20th, 1897, these two walk up to the scaffold, and 2 minutes later, the death sentence was read. And it's then that Alonzo Walling said, quote, I was not there, and I am innocent of the whole crime. I cannot say any more, end quote.
He wasn't going to say any more.
Yeah.
I don't think he had a choice.
You're absolutely right. The Reverend Lee said a prayer for them both, and in, quote, a flash, two bodies hurtled downward and in apparent agony, since the necks of neither had been broken by the drop.
Oh.
There was a contraction of the bodies as the noose about each neck began the work of strangulation.
Wow.
A second later came relaxation, and two forms hanging limp and fully contracted swayed in midair. End quote.
Well, that was flowery.
It was from the newspaper.
Man, a lot of frustrated writers on those newspapers back then.
Yeah. I did read the hangings actually happened in Newport, Kentucky, and they were the very last hangings ever.
Public executions.
Yes.
Yeah.
And after these two bodies are taken down, they dismantled the scaffolding. They dismantled the gallows.
Gotcha.
And that was it. But what about Pearl's missing head?
Right.
Because these two guys go to their death and never say what happened to Pearl's head.
Right.
One theory is that they threw her head into the Ohio River near where the murder occurred in Fort Thomas, Kentucky. This was one of the explanations Scott Jackson and Alonzo Walling gave during their trials, though no evidence was found to support it, despite all these searches in the river. Now, the Ohio River is not clean.
No.
It is muddy. And I don't know what it looked like 128 years ago, but I don't know how you would ever find a single severed head.
Yeah, I mean, it's a strong current, too. I mean, if that thing could be down the Mississippi by
yeah,
then.
it's now hooked up with the Mississippi River.
Yeah.
The Cincinnati detective Cal Krim, his theory in 1937 when they interviewed him was that Scott and Alonzo may have burned Pearl's head in a furnace at the Ohio College of Dental Surgery, where they were students.
Sure.
But there's no concrete evidence backing this either, other than the fact that they came and got the suitcase.
Right.
They left, and then they came back. And that bar was across the street from the dental school.
Yeah. The thing that amazes me, why did they bring the suitcase back?
Yeah.
I mean, it just makes no sense.
I mean, for two guys who were so smart, they thought they could actually perform an abortion if they only had the right tools, right?
Yeah, that's like me working on my car. If I had the right screwdriver, I know I could do this.
Yeah. I mean, I think they thought they were pretty smart, and I think they thought that they'd covered their tracks.
Sure.
I think they were idiots.
Yeah. Pretty much.
There are some theories that suggest Pearl's head may have been buried in the vicinity of the murder scene in Fort Thomas or nearby, like Dayton, Kentucky.
Right.
Because in 1900 and in 1907, skulls were found, and it was speculated that one of those might have been Pearl's. But neither really matched her remains.
Gotcha.
Finally, a more sensational theory, fueled by claims of the site being haunted, is that Scott Jackson disposed of Pearl's head by throwing it down an old well located where now Bob Mackey's Music World in Wilder, Kentucky is located.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
The old well is actually located in the basement of Bobby Mackey's Music World.
Wow.
But historians have dismissed this as an extremely unlikely fact,
right,
given that the additional 17 miles they would have had to take to get from the murder scene to where Bob Mackey's place is today.
Right.
But this is why many people think that Pearl Bryan is one of the many who haunt Bobby Mackey's Music World.
Oh, really?
Bobby Mackey's Music World is a country music venue that's become famous, or infamous maybe,
right,
for being promoted as one of the most haunted places in America.
Wow.
The building dates back to the early 20th century and has served various purposes like a slaughterhouse, a roadhouse, an illegal gambling den, all before becoming the nightclub. Now, the site where Bobby Mackey's Music World now stands was once a slaughterhouse in the mid-1800s. The basement of the slaughterhouse contained a well where animal blood and entrails were disposed of. And this well has been referred to as, quote, a portal to hell, end quote.
Wow.
That's what they call it in all of these ghost hunting shows and tours. Yeah. They just add to the eerie atmosphere of the location.
Right.
After the slaughterhouse closed, it was reportedly used by a satanic group for rituals and sacrifices. And so this lore has been woven into the narrative of Pearl Bryan's murder because it's close by.
Sure.
And some of the legends suggested that her head was disposed of in this well, the well that was used by the satanic group.
Right.
Now, over the years, numerous ghost stories and paranormal investigators have claimed that Pearl's spirit haunts Bobby Mackey's Music World. And paranormal investigators have reported various phenomena such as voices, apparitions, and physical sensations which they attribute to Pearl's restless spirit.
Really?
Yeah. There have been numerous folk songs written about Pearl's murder, the first few in the 1910s and 20s. Then in 2001, San Francisco-based folklore band The Crooked Jades recorded a song that focused on the murder titled Pearl Bryan, and it appears on their album Seven Sisters, A Kentucky Portrait. Pearl's body was taken back to Greencastle, Indiana, and buried without her head in the Forest Hill Cemetery. And when people visit her grave, they leave pennies, head side up.
Yeah.
It's a tradition meant to ensure that she will not be headless on Resurrection Day.
Wow.
But that is the story of Pearl Bryan, and that's all I have to say about that. She is only one, but what if one is all that's needed? Hospice nurse Indy Luce has fallen in love. After caring for billionaire Louis Thornberry until his final breath, she's now engaged to marry the heir apparent of the global tech empire, David Thornberry. But as the divinely marked Indy packs up her old life to begin anew, a sacred promise comes back to haunt her with a vengeance. As an unrelenting spiritual battle unfolds in the shadows, the descendants of those like Indy find themselves persistently lured and ensnared as a relentless surge of evil becomes an unstoppable force. With malevolent entities following her every step, what Indy doesn't know about her family's sacred covenant could tip the scales of good and evil. The follow-up to the paranormal suspense novel Lead Me From Temptation and Book 2 of the Divine Darkness series, Deliver Me From Evil, is now available March 29th, 2024, wherever you buy or download books, or go to chriscalvert.com. If evil prowls seeking someone to devour, can one woman seek and save that which is lost?
Wow, what a crazy case. And here's the thing, too. My grandmother's name was Pearl West. So every time I heard that name Pearl, which I've never heard before other than my grandmother, it's like her image keeps coming into my head. But that is just a gruesome story.
It's a little bit crazy. I had an Aunt Pearl.
Oh, did
I also had an Aunt Ruby as well. You know, there's that whole list of, gems that women were called.
Yeah,
so,
yeah.
But yeah, Pearl, and she didn't do anything. Her biggest crime was that, she loved Scott and she got pregnant.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's just hard to believe that somebody could be that ruthless and that cold.
It's hard to believe that he thought he could get away with any of that or all of it.
Yeah, well, sometimes the smartest people are the dumbest people.
The ones who think they know the most. I thought it was interesting about leaving the pennies head up.
Yeah.
Yeah. Also, the fact that she's buried there, and you know, when you visit the grave, I think they had to eventually unmark it because people were coming by and taking pieces of her headstone. But you just know that she's not all there.
Right.
Yeah.
It's sad.
Very sad.
Well, let's move on to some other dumb people.
Okay.
And do a little bless your heart.
Well, bless your heart.
All right. For today, I'm going to do 10 bless your hearts.
10?
But I'm going to do them in 60 seconds.
What?
Okay, you ready?
Y'all, this is what I live with.
All right, here we go. Number 1, and go. A couple discovered a burglar in their house after the burglar laughed at the husband's joke. I'm sure it was a dad joke. Number 2, a man high on bath salts breaks into a house and puts up Christmas decorations. Usually you have to pay good money for that kind of service. Number 3, a man reports thieves stole his cannabis plant, calls the police to report the theft, and gets himself arrested. In his defense, the police do say you should report a crime anytime it occurs. Number 4, a man's flatulence gets him charged with battery. I mean, how bad is it to get yourself arrested? Number 5, a man pawns stolen jewelry at a store that was managed by the woman he robbed. Look in the dictionary under loser and you'll find his picture. Number 7, a man breaks into a Pizza Hut and fries wings. I love wings, so I sort of empathize. Number 8, a son robs his mom because he thought he could only be charged with burglary if done at night. I got nothing. Number 9, a man eats his own underwear hoping to beat a breathalyzer test. I hear the Calvin Kleins have a smoother aftertaste than jockeys. And finally, number 10, a Romanian parliament member tries to bribe people with fried chicken. You had me at chicken. Ta-da! Oh, man.
You did it.
I did it. So there's your bless your hearts for this week.
Oh, my gosh, honey. Bless your heart.
Well, there you go.
For doing that. I got nothing. I got nothing.
Well.
Nothing. Well, if you have a bless your heart or you know somebody's heart who needs blessing, all you got to do is go to hitchtohomicide.com where there's a pull-down menu.
Yep.
While you're there, you can also suggest a case and also tell us about your brush with true crime. Tell us your own true crime story.
Yes, under 60 seconds.
In under 60 seconds. That is my husband.
And that's my bride.
What is happening?
I don't know.
Join us next time on Hitch to Homicide.
Bye, y'all.